for the first Pres audience, what we wanted to do, we thought would be fun and good to see is how the residents are doing. So we're going to do a little checkup on the residents and do a couple of interviews here to just for something to do, right? Something for you guys to see how our residents are thinking about what life is like during social isolation and some of their early experiences in the residency. Obviously, Keith and Alexandra are at a different point in the residency than Nate is. Nate is going into the latter part of his second year with us, and Keith and Alexandra have been here for almost 9 months now, right?
Yep.
Gosh, that went by really fast. Okay, so I have a list of questions that I'm going to ask all the residents, and then we'll kind of have a little roundtable discussion. We hope this isn't super contrived. Obviously, there are a few questions for y'all, but we'll kind of let the conversation go where it goes, and hopefully we'll wrap up in 30 to 45 minutes, depending. If it gets more than 45, we'll probably end it there, and we'll save the other questions for another interview. So as you guys can see, I've grown out my quarantine beard. How are you guys handling the quarantine right now?
Yeah, I was going to say that my hair is a lot longer than it was before, but
I was afraid of turning into Samson. Should probably shave.
Yeah, you and me both, Keith. My Samson locks are flowing, and I've been concerned. Actually, my barber lives with me, very close to me. He is myself.
Yeah. So I was going to say that I'm like, the reason I'm wearing a hat is because I was scheduled to get a haircut like literally 3 days before the Governor Cooper announced his order. So it's getting a little wild. So I didn't want everyone to see me this disheveled. Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and start here. And like I said, it's just going to kind of go in whatever direction it goes. So the first question that I have for y'all is how are each of you thinking about like what is going on right now, like generically and in regards to what it means for the church?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think like this is a moment of both great tragedy and hardship, but also opportunity. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how I'm seeing it. Obviously, you hear the stories about people in New York City and some of these hot spots where healthcare workers are really under a lot of stress, and people are under a lot of stress there medically. And then you think of the economic hardships that people are facing. And that's certainly been on our minds in the news a lot. But then I also think there are glimmers of hope that I'm seeing in terms of thinking about, who we value in society. I think is becoming really clear about things like the people who work in our grocery stores and are on our supply chains and are often kind of forgotten. I think they've been lifted up in a really positive way. I think about things like you see pictures in India of people seeing the Himalaya for the first time in decades because pollution is down. So there's this mixed bag of just blessings and opportunity, and also great sorrow is kind of how I'm thinking about it.
And I think like something I've been thinking about a lot is this feels like a unique moment because we are all right in our community experiencing the same set of external circumstances, but they're affecting everyone so differently. Just even thinking about within our church community, even smaller than that, within our young adult small groups, right? There are people who are married with young kids, and that's a totally different experience than those of us like me who like, I live by myself and I'm not bored, but I'm a little bored, I guess. And, other people who live in nursing homes, that's a totally different experience. So I'm thinking a lot about, where the parallels between this sort of season of our communal life together and other things that have happened in history. And having trouble thinking of things. It's just really interesting to think about.
It's been really interesting to see like how community functions during this. Like on one hand, we're virtually maintaining our church community. But on the other hand, like, I'm out on the streets every day walking and meeting neighbors from a safe distance and more engaged in the community immediately around me more than I have been since starting this stuff. Like, it used to be like community was what I showed up to, and now community is just what exists around me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Keith, that reminds me of, there are folks in our neighborhood that we've lived here a year and a half now that I don't think I've ever seen before, that now I've seen multiple times on walks. And we've gotten to know our neighbors a lot better, which is really cool, from, across the road and waving and talking and that kind of thing. But there is something really beautiful about that, for sure.
Is that when you sit outside or you go on walks, don't you see, like, it's weird to see that the roads are just like packed with people speed walking, like I have a German short hair who loves to walk. And like, we've been on so many walks that I pick up the leash now and he goes and hides. He's just like, dude, I can't do another one today. And like you said, Nate, like, I don't think you want to try to redeem any of the sorrow and the hardships that are going on, but also recognizing that, like, because it has shifted the way we live our lives, it creates new opportunities for relationship and community. Yeah. So are you guys doing a lot of walking right now?
Yep. I'm doing a couch to 5K situation.
Nice.
Because my gym's closed. So yeah, but I feel like I'm seeing a lot more. Latham Park is so close to where I live, and I just never really, it's like, it's not until you start walking or riding your bike or whatever that you realize how close things are to you. So that's been kind of fun. But Nate, getting to know your community is not always beautiful. I think that my upstairs neighbor has taken up the trumpet. Not the most exciting thing. It's either the trumpet or the trombone. I can't tell, but...
Yeah. So speaking of that, I know at our place, so when it was really windy last week, or maybe like this weekend, I think, one of the trees along one of our side streets, like, just uprooted and fell on the power lines. And it was like probably 10 o'clock at night. And like the whole neighborhood came out to watch. And somebody joked, like, we all came out to see, like, the tree, and the police are going to come and arrest us all because this is like a gathering of 35 people. So we were all like at the end of the street just watching this thing. But like I said, it was like people I didn't even know existed before this have come out during.
That's big entertainment right now. Tree comes down, everybody's like, whoo, gotta check that out.
Well, especially because it cut off like everybody's movies and the Wi-Fi was gone. So it's like this, we can't. The social isolation is one thing, but if we can't have power, this is going to become rough very quickly. So okay, well, jumping into the second question here. This is I think I wrote these questions almost 6 weeks ago now when we thought about doing this in one-on-ones, and so it does seem a little more unprecedented now. But what professional experiences, life experiences, or seminary experiences have prepared y'all most for what it might be like to minister during a pandemic? So if you're anything like me, I mean, I talk to my parents and my grandparents and keep reiterating, like, nothing like what's going on right now has happened in their lifetimes. So it just seems like it's really, really difficult to get perspective. Like, how, like, I don't want to call it historic, but I think that's the right word for it. You know what I mean when I say that. It's really difficult, I think, to kind of get critical distance from this thing going on right now. But is there anything in your lives or, during seminary or professionally that has like prepared you for any aspect of this? Like, Nate, I was thinking specifically since you hiked the AT, I'm sure there were some times where some really critical isolation was going on during that period. So I just wanted to throw that at you guys to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that when you asked that question too, about it's not really ministering, I guess, in some ways of how I think about this. But so after college, I spent 4.5 months hiking the Appalachian Trail. And then before seminary, I did another 2-month 1,000 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail. And on those trips, spent a lot of time by myself in my head doing something very monotonous. And I was thinking there are some parallels between those experiences and this in terms of, you can spend a lot of your time like putting your head against the wall in the routine and the monotony of life. But there's something that's kind of beautiful that breaks through after a while too, of just like noticing things, kind of what we were just talking about. Like you start to notice things that you haven't noticed before, and you start to rework things in your past and in your life that you haven't worked before. And when you have the space and the time to be freed up to like really live in your internal life a little bit, I think that's an opportunity that could be missed right now for a lot of people. And I certainly think, right, like within our Christian tradition, I'm thinking about the monastic movements and the desert fathers and all these people that went into social isolation to get in touch with God. So I've been thinking a lot about how can we tap into those resources and that part of our tradition in this time, and know that, people, I'm fortunate, like I have my wife and my daughter and my dog, and like I don't feel very lonely. But that's not the case for a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who are by themselves in basically their monastic cell, which could be a room in a nursing home. It could be a room in their apartment. It could be a lot of different things, but we do have resources in a tradition of people who found God in those kinds of spaces. So, yeah.
That makes me think, Nate, of Annie Dillard's book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, where she talks, it's just a lot about, right, noticing the little tiny things. She talks a lot about nature and what it's like to take a walk and actually notice the little bugs on the blades of grass and things like that. But I think like, I've talked about this in a sermon before, but I had a seminary professor, my preaching professor, who in our introductory preaching course would have everyone write their own parable every week. So the kingdom of God is like fill in the blank. And there were these assignments of you would have to go out into the world. And one week you would have to, go to the DMV or go out into your neighborhood or go to a school or something like that. And just like sit for a half an hour and watch and see where the kingdom of God is present among the community that you're in. And so I think I've thought a lot about that in this time, just like noticing God's presence and noticing the movement of the Spirit in ways that I haven't had to notice before because the pace of life is so different. That's pretty abstract. I think the other thing that's prepared me is just, I don't know if I'm technically a digital native, but I feel like when I've grown up with technology, it's like another appendage to me, my phone and my computer and my tablet. So that's definitely prepared me for like helping people navigate technology, I guess, which has been a big struggle, I know, for a lot of communities.
Alexandra, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because something that I've thought about like just in the last week is how I pop open my laptop and like, even if I don't know how to use Zoom, I can figure it out, where like I'm sort of like tech support for, a different generation in my family, kind of Midwest small town folks. And so like for them, like the context outside has changed, but the context inside their homes has changed so much as well. And so I've really thought about that a lot, just like as an advantage growing up with like the internet, in my house, and how that I never knew life before the internet. And so it does seem, like you said, like I'm a native that feels more comfortable in this space. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Keith, how about you?
Yeah, so obviously nothing I've experienced has prepared me for this, because this is stuff that honestly like nobody living has experienced what this type of thing is. I've been thinking a lot about two things that my favorite professor in seminary told us, and one of them was it was like the last day of class, and this class was mainly third years about to graduate, and he said he apologized for all the ways that seminary is going to fail us as we go into ministry, and talking about all this stuff that we're going to experience that we have not been prepared for at all. And this feels like very much one of those things where everybody in ministry, like the older folks like Danny who have been doing this for a while, the medium folks like Dolly and Neil who have been doing it for a while, and us, like none of us have done this, and none of us know what to actually do to, like, how do you do a pandemic correctly? Like we don't have a guidebook on that. But then the other thing that he said was that like 95% of ministry is showing up. And it seems like if we stay true to that, is what to showing up, like that seems to be a good way to get through this. Now the question is, what does showing up look like?
Right.
And I think that like the way that a lot of us on the pastoral staff have like names that we call every week and people we're checking on. And that seems to be what showing up looks like now. But as long as we're like doing something that looks like showing up, then we're doing something right.
Yeah. So thinking about what you said and kind of and turning it in another direction, how well do you think people were prepared for the fact that sometimes not showing up is what it means to be a good neighbor at this time? And what I don't mean is like not showing up and calling people, but like I never imagined the church's, the most righteous or the most moral thing that the church could do would be to tell people not to come into the building. I mean, that goes sort of antithetical to I think anything that I've ever thought about ministry in my entire life. And so now that what showing up means has changed so much, how do you understand like isolation as a loving act or a gesture of like neighborly love?
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about fasting practices, which I struggle with concepts of fasting because I have a history of difficult relationship with my body and eating and things like that. And so I've sort of resisted those kinds of spiritual disciplines, or however you want to name them. But I've been thinking a lot about, how our community has chosen not to celebrate the sacraments in this moment. And that is a form of fasting from the kind of spiritual nourishment that we would almost perhaps take for granted, particularly in this time when we've moved to a more frequent celebration of the sacrament. So that's one way that I'm sort of trying to frame things regarding staying home, like almost fasting from embodied community. But again, that's not something I ever would have thought of before. And it's something that I hope we don't have to take into the future. That's like a hope that I have and like a fear that I have thinking about what community looks like right now.
For sure.
Yeah, Alexander, I think that's really wise. And I think that's a good way to look at it in terms of hopefully this shows us, the things that we miss are the things that matter to us. Yeah. And I like in a weird way. So one of my mentors and friends that I talk to regularly was talking to, he sent me a text on Easter and he's just like, I'm just like heartbroken not to be in church today. And just really, really missing my church family and community. And I like responded, I was like, honestly, I'm really sorry, but this actually kind of makes me really glad too. Because when I get cynical, sometimes I wonder how much the church matters to people today. And I think in some ways it's really like, for me, it's like, wow, that's really, really awesome that like, on Easter morning, when you're not there, you're like heartbroken. And I think that's how we should view the community of faith all the time. But maybe this is a chance to be reminded of that, kind of in that fasting way that you're talking about, Alexandra.
Although fasting, I'm just thinking out loud now, you choose to fast, right? That's not, whereas this sort of feels like there's almost no choice. So that's like a pretty big difference. But yeah, it reveals something. Abstaining from this thing that's really important to you does reveal something about your desires in an important way, I think.
Yeah, I know. So a couple of you were on the call when we talked with the some of the young adult members of our church. And what I found so remarkable was like there was this moment that was sort of microcosmic within the greater like experience of getting together with those folks. And it was when a couple who have moved away, they were still on the email list, and they joined us for those Zoom calls. And it was it was so awesome to see those folks that I hadn't seen since, I think we played golf with Juan, when they were leaving to move to Raleigh. And that was, 8 months ago. And so it was weird that it was like they, some of these folks were seeing, this couple and their children for the first time in a long time. And that was sort of like an embodiment of all of the people that they hadn't maybe even seen for 3 or 4 weeks. But it was just this like cool thing where, it's like really tender. And you realize, it's like, it's the cliche, like you don't know what you have till it's gone. But really, I mean, when I was a kid, church was always really boring, and now I would just love to go to church. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I'm with you. Like it really puts things under a microscope for sure. Okay, let's move on to the third question. This is sort of switching gears here. So this is kind of trying to get a broader understanding. And I think some of our members who are more up in age will be interested to hear your guys' thoughts about this, because it might be a lot different than what they think the church will look like. So when you think about what the church is going to look like when you retire, what do you see? What does the church look like? I know Keith. Oh, sorry. I know Keith. When we did our first little mock interview with this, you had a really interesting answer. So would you, and maybe a little provocative. So would you mind kicking us off here?
What my answer was.
Well, I think it was more like bivocational pastors.
Yeah.
You're thinking about bivocational pastor, a lot of that, and a lot of less institutionalized. More.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the direction we'll be going, where I think a lot, like most churches, most congregations are not like First Pres. They are like where I come from, a large congregation is a tenth of the size of First Pres, and usually is just one pastor and an administrator, maybe a part-time music or youth or children's person. And as our generic congregation continues to get smaller, I do think that we're going to be going towards bivocational ministry. And another thing that, at least in the more rural areas, has been tossed around is like the idea of the parish model, where like there's a large central building and congregation, but then there are other congregations that are like helped out and maintained by the larger one, where like I'm thinking of back home, there are several, I mean like 3 or 4. There are a few Presbyterian congregations that don't have full-time pastors and have about 20 members on like on the high side, like between 10 and 20 members, where the future of ministry may look like having one central location and then like certified ruling elders going out and performing pastoral roles when that's really not their day job whatsoever. And so a good part of that is like that really ups our lay education, and makes it where like our lay people are more involved in doing hands-on ministry than what it looks like right now. I think that's a positive spin on it. The other one is like the other part is like things are going to get smaller, and it looks like they're going to continue to get smaller, and we'll have less and less people and less pastors.
Does anybody want to have their own ideas or want to respond to that?
I was going to joke. I said, when I retire, next year and I'm off,
No.
Showing up to Presbyterian meetings saying Nate Sell honorably retired. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, a lot of what Keith says resonates with me as true and likely. I'm really intrigued by that parish model. I think that's something cool to think about. So the Christian narrative is the life, death, and resurrection, right? That's like our story. And I think right now the church is like undergoing this like kind of a death of sorts. I'm going to speak just about the PCUSA to be a little bit more clear, because I think the church is too colossal to wrap my mind around. So I think the PCUSA, like some things are dying off right now and some things are being resurrected. And we're in that kind of weird zone in between those two things that we're not sure what we are yet. And I used to be really freaked out by kind of the decline and death of the PCUSA, but I'm not anymore. I'm actually really hopeful about where we're going. And I think because of that narrative, I think like some things that are dying off right now maybe should. I think the idea that, for a long time, people went to church because of societal expectations or norms rather than out of a true sense of discipleship. And I think that more and more, especially in the Northeast and increasingly in other places in America, like if you're still going to church, like you're pretty bought in, like you want to be there, you are passionate about being there. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think that'll continue to happen throughout the US. And what we'll be left with, which I'm hopeful about, is a pretty small but really vibrant denomination. And I don't know if this is true, but what I'm hoping to is that it'll be a highly liturgical denomination that is creedal in terms of, can say the Apostles' Creed without crossing their fingers behind their back and mean it. And I also think like it'll be a probably very socially engaged denomination. So that's my hopes. And I think there's good reason to have that hope for our denomination.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one of the reasons, that we started doing this membership restoration project, right, was, like you said, to kind of, we didn't want to shoo anybody away, of course, but we wanted to know who we were. Like we wanted to be able to know who the kind of faithful folks that we could say like, okay, when our new pastor comes, when our new senior pastor comes, who's on the roster, right? Like we don't want to be stuck in free agency. We want to know like who's with us. Alexander, I know how much you're into sports, so that was just more of a, but right to kind of like you said, like, hey, there are more expectations about what it means to be a member here at the church, and obviously, what Christ expects is holiness, but is willing to love us even outside of that. But still, like, I think that's right. Like I think about kind of the European countries where the folks who are going to church, they believe the stuff. I mean, they are committed. They're reading their devotionals. They are, going to morning and evening prayer most days of the week. And there's it's hard because I think sometimes in America we look at those places and think like, oh, Christianity is in peril, but really there's a vibrancy and there's a depth to what Christianity looks like in those places. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least the mainline of the United States is kind of following behind on that. But Alexandra, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. I mean, I think one of the things that I hope, this might be jumping the gun on the next question, but one of the things that I hope is that denominations like ours can start to be more honest with ourselves about who we really are. Kind of like you were saying, Nate, just like that churches like ours might look around at churches in rural parts of the country and say like, oh, the church our denomination doesn't all look like we look right now. And there's a good chance we're moving towards other models of being church together. And I hope that that's a joyful thing rather than a scary thing for folks. That's the hard part, I think, is sort of mourning what once was. But one of the things that I keep saying in this residency, and like not just at First Pres, but everywhere I am, it's just like church congregations are not businesses. And we might operate like we're businesses, and you might think that we're a business, but we're really not. And I think a lot about how that hopefully will become more and more true as individual congregations maybe become smaller and have to operate differently, and just sort of coming to terms with the way that we've conceptualized congregations in terms of business or capitalism or whatever it might be. I kind of took a left turn there, but
no, I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah. Sorry, Keith, go ahead.
Sorry. It's important to add, and this is probably going into the next question that Alexander's already alluded to, where the one true church, visible and invisible, that spans across time and space, like, it's fine, and it's gonna be fine. The question is, what does the institutional church that we have, what's it going to look like? But I do think that we can find a lot of hope in the part where, like, regardless of what happens in the world, the one true church, like, it's good and well, and things are great there.
Yeah. So
yeah, absolutely. Like if we don't believe that, and we don't believe that Christ is the head of the church, then we should just pack it up now, because we're already sunk, right?
Yeah.
So
and doesn't it seem like if there is like sort of a doubling down on that belief, like on that, like, no, the church is going to be fine for eternity, it'll allow, like what Alexandra said, for us to be a little more honest about who we are, and like maybe we'll make our actions a little more intentional and say, like, hey, look, we're not worried about this ship sinking. We're worried about faithfulness and what that looks like. So I have one little quick follow-up, and then we're going a little long, and I knew we would. But we'll get to two more questions after this. My follow-up is like, as if we think sort of some of these larger churches are going to take on a new shape or a new role in the coming years, like, what does that do? And I'm not an ordained clergy in the Presbyterian Church. What do we think, like, that's going to do to what the pastor looks like, right? Like, what the role of the pastor is, because it seems to me like churches like ours, most times there's a pulpiteer, right, where the senior pastor's role is to craft these beautiful sermons. And not to say that they can't do that anyway, but right, if they're the ones that are kind of doing all the discipleship calls and doing all the membership transfers and also like visiting people in the hospital, do you think that's going to change the shape of that at all? I just welcome your thoughts on that.
I was talking with my significant other the other day, maybe a week ago, about how she's also a pastor, for context. What would it look like if pastors, like the head pastor of a church, was not the person who was known for like doing the big, great sermons, but was like the outreach pastor who's known for being in the community? And I think that's actually a model I would be really hopeful for, where pastors are like faces in the community that are known for doing good among their neighbors, much more so than they're known for their public speaking abilities on a Sunday morning.
I think my hope and what I actually think is going to happen is, like, every pastor I know didn't go to seminary to like be a CFO. They went because, at least I'll speak for myself, like, I'm drawn to the core of the pastorate, which is preaching and teaching and like visiting people when they're sick and trying to get people engaged in outreach, right? And I think that's what I see as that's the historical core of the pastorate, and I'm very hopeful that will be the core moving forward. So yeah, kind of like same as it ever was, just a doubling down on that tradition is what I'm hoping. And I think certainly what Keith is saying is part of that, of showing up to be visible in the community, for sure.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So
the parish model that I proposed works, and I think there will be a lot more teaching that is responsibility of pastors, where they would be like kind of like what Calvin did, where like got the pastors together and taught and had a Bible study, and then they went out and did their own things in other congregations.
Well, and actually that's really interesting because, once I took on the discipleship position, I read all these histories of, First Pres Greensboro, and one of the legacies of First Pres was when it started, like one of the reasons it got so popular was the founding pastor used to have these lecture series, and like they actually had like a church sanctuary and then like a lecture hall, basically. So it's one of these things where I think people think that that's a real radical new thing, but it's actually more faithful to like what it might have been, the church might have been like in the 19th century. And like the 20th century has seen like pastor as, and this isn't bad in and of itself, but the pastor is like fundraiser, right? Or like CFO, or like Nate said, and so but it's actually more traditional to have the kind of educator, preacher, preaching at funerals, those sorts of things, as opposed to like, managing. So, okay, we'll move on to the next question before I get myself in trouble. What are your hopes and fears for the church at large? So this isn't talking about the PCUSA, but this is talking about like what Keith would call the one true Kirk.
Scott's confession all the way.
and so right, like we see in globally Christianity becoming not becoming, already is more of a religion of the global South as opposed to a religion of the West, right? Like I know that I think in 2015 or 2016 was the first year that the continent of Africa was sending more missionaries to the continent of North America than the continent of North America was sending to the continent of Africa, which is like, might surprise some people, but I think that's a really welcoming sign in some ways. So I just want to know what your hopes are, and also like what sort of like, if you wake up in a cold sweat at night thinking about the church, what that looks like. Don't scare anybody though. Keep it PG, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hope that like, I don't really know how to talk about like the big church, but I hope that the church will listen to and learn from those folks who are now in the majority who once weren't or were thought not to be, right? And that we would learn from cultural expressions of faith that aren't centered around white Western folks in a way that they have been in the past. And I also hope that the sacraments continue to be central to the life of the church. That's like my main hope for the church, period, that we would be constituted by the word and the sacraments centrally.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely resonate with that, Alexander. I think that's sacramental theology is pretty core to my hope too. And I had mentioned, I think a little earlier, about how I'm hopeful that liturgy is making a comeback. I think if millennials, speaking in broad strokes, are like hokiness radar and BS radars, like pretty good, I think. And I think that like ancient liturgy, which is beautiful and this great inheritance of the church, I think that's our number one safeguard against hokiness. So I'm really, really hopeful that is and will continue to make a comeback. Yeah, and I think along with that, right, that I think the mainline church in the U.S., understandably so, has been sucked into the like attractional model of ministry, in terms of like we hear about church shopping and those kinds of metaphors, right? And what scares me is the necessity to be attractional, as if like Christ isn't attractional enough. And then also it scares me of are people, Matt and I have talked a lot about this, like, are people willing to be shaped by an authority other than themselves? And are people willing to let the church shape them? And I don't know if those conditions and possibilities are present right now with the masses in America. So that I narrowed your scope down, Matt, from the church at large to the American church. But I think that's kind of the crux of what the church can be and what the church is are people willing to, submit to authority, which is like the least American thing you can do. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm just piggybacking off of something that you both said, right? Like, it's interesting to me, like how we view some of these things as sort of like optional. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I don't know if I really feel like loving my neighbor. and so instead, I choose to, and I think maybe this is what you, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, Alexandra, but instead of thinking about like the word and the sacrament as like sort of the center of the church, is like that's what the church is actually. Yeah. And this community that does these things. And so, yeah, I noticed that you guys all went to your hopes and not your fears, but I think placed in there was like the biggest fear. What I heard through both of your comments was like the church as some kind of market, right? Or the church like chasing some kind of feeling that maybe folks in the West have gotten from other sources, right? Binge watching or something, right? Like that, like, the church, what's important for the church in America to do is to capture that like spirit of that, like, and just like, so people can latch onto it, as opposed to being faithful and being okay with like saying like, yeah, reading the Sermon on the Mount every day and understanding what Jesus promised to the church and being like, whew, I'm not sure I'm not sure that's what I signed up for. So thank you for that, Keith. I know that when I interviewed you first, so just a little background, we were going to do these interviews as one-on-ones. And so Keith and I met in front of a fireplace, to do the first one. And it took too long. It was like an hour and a half and all the audio was washed. So, you couldn't hear anything. So that was good. But,
will you make the video of that available just to watch you guys talking by a fireplace? Because if we get real bored, that could be,
Yeah. So in that, Keith, the way you answered this question was to like, I enjoyed it because it was sort of like, it was a piece of Christian education and kind of educating people on sort of the trends in younger pastors and seminaries now on neo-orthodoxy and sort of the rise of like a new orthodoxy in the church.
So like, and I remember that I was proud of that answer. It's a shame that the first recording didn't work.
Yeah.
But really basically in cliche is like, my hope is that the church, small c, will be the church, big C. My fear is that it will not. Where really think about like in the American context, my hope is that the American church will be the church and loose all ties to political loyalty and like still be political, but be political according to the witness of Jesus Christ, rather than fitting Jesus Christ into an already existing American political ideology. And the farther away we can separate those, I think the better. And I am hopeful and part of it is also just like working with you three, because I know that we've talked about it a lot, where like, there's this trend of neo-orthodoxy where you three, my other pastor friends that are about our age coming out of seminary, like, this stuff matters to us. And we care about being Christian and being Christian before we are anything else. And I find that really hopeful where, like, stuff may be getting smaller, stuff like may like ultra politicized in like depending on where you attend on Sunday mornings. But the young crop of pastors and church leaders that are coming out right now, like, we really care about being Christian and following Jesus, knowing our Bible, knowing Scripture and our tradition, and holding on to those things tighter than we hold on to other stuff.
Keith, can I kind of jump in and steal Matt's microphone for a second? When you just kind of did it, but when you say neo-Orthodox, like, what does that mean in terms, because I think some people might hear that and think like fundamentalist or something that we're not, or that we are no longer like open and affirming to like the gay community, or so. And I want to make some caveats that that's not what we're talking about, but I'd love to hear you explain that.
So I think the best way to explain it is like we're returning to, like, we care about our creeds, we care about what the tradition is, but it's not the same as fundamentalism, where that's a very conservative understanding of Christianity, but more like, because of Scripture, because of our creeds, that then leads us to places where we have to be even more affirming than we would be otherwise, where we look at the radical welcome of Jesus and we say we have to model that. Therefore, we have to be even more affirming than we look like we are on paper. That sort of thing.
And I just add, like, I think, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but I think it's good to know, if you're watching this, that like fundamentalism is new.
It's a project,
and this is going to get me in trouble, but it's true. It's a fundamentally anti-intellectual pursuit. Now, it can get very smart. Fundamentalism can get very smart, but it is, to quote Stanley Hauerwas, anti-intellectual. And what I mean by that is that, like, I think sometimes when we think about fundamentalism, we think about traditional. And actually, fundamentalism is really, really been popularized in the 20th century and even started in the 19th century. So fundamentalism is not traditional. Actually, orthodox is a different thing than fundamentalism. And I think what I would say, and I know you didn't ask me, but I'm going to add anyway, because this is my Zoom meeting, is that, like, the way you ask questions is different. And so you're going to get different answers, right? And so the question becomes, like, what is a faithful witness, as opposed to any other question that you could ask, right? What is going to grow the church? Or instead of asking, like, how long a certain sacramental blessing is going to be, ask whether it's faithful. Is it true? Is it good? Is it what the church ought to be doing? So when you change the questions you ask and what questions that you ask, and those things become more important, I think you're going to get more orthodox answers. And what I think is, like, this is a generational thing, right? It's like, I think the previous generation was unsure about, like, or maybe suspected that the creeds and these kinds of things might be oppressive, or might be like the old, something of old. And I think the new generation of pastors are doubling down on neo-orthodoxy. But I went to a school that had a big neo-orthodox movement, so it could be just my bias. But yeah, so that's me hijacking the conversation for a second. All right, so let's move on. So this is the last question that we'll do today. So this is going to be sort of a generic question. Do you feel like seminary prepared you well for congregational ministry? And how would you improve the seminary experience? King for a day question. Or queen for a day.
I'll say something that kind of, this isn't meant to be shots fired, but it might sound like that. And so I loved seminary. Like, I ate it up. I loved every minute of it. And there are a lot of classes that I don't know feel particularly relevant to congregational ministry right now. So, for example, like, I took a whole class on War and the Christian Conscience. Okay. And that was an amazing course. I think like Keith did a TED Talk class where we talked about this for maybe like 20 minutes. So you might say like, my time would have been better spent learning how to run a church budget or something like that. But this goes back to kind of all the things that we've just been swirling around, right?
Right.
Like, I don't think that's the problem with seminary. I think that's the problem of what we've been focusing on in the church, right? And so that's not to say like budgets are important. We need to learn how to do all those things, but I would not have sacrificed classes like War and the Christian Conscience for running a committee meeting. I just don't think that's the purpose of seminary. And all that's to say is like First Pres has been awesome and great to me, and that's not meant to be a shot at First Pres. I just think like the things we're focusing on in seminary are actually some of the things that we should be focusing on in the church as well. Does that make sense?
Yes. Holster your weapon. I'm just kidding.
I think that my answer will be kind of parallel to Nate's, but also like not. Where I feel like it would be, at least at Duke, where I went to school and where Matt went to school, I felt like there really was not much focus on practical theology, and like how to, like the War and the Christian Conscience is a great class, and I definitely would have taken it. But I feel like mainly the academy in general, and especially the version of it that I experienced, like, is doing a really poor job of taking that class and then translating it into what does that look like with our hands and our feet. We're missing that practical theology, like translation piece. And also, like at Duke, only one practical theology class is required in order to graduate with an MDiv, which is not a graduate degree, it's a professional degree. And so it's a degree that's supposed to train you to do a job. And only one class is required in the thing of like actually doing the job. And that was Intro to Preaching. Now you do also have to do 2 internships to graduate, but it seems like at least those requirements really show there's not a focus right now, at least at Duke, and I feel like it is in the larger academy, of like, this is what learning all of this stuff looks like when you're performing in the parish. And I did have some really great professors who would tell us things like, you need to know about the Trinity and all of these arguments in like the 4th century, so that when you're in a hospital sitting next to someone, you can say these things with confidence. But I don't think that the academy structure right now is geared toward making that translational piece of, yeah, we learn all these things and they're super cool, but this is why they actually matter in real life.
And it's worth observing that the 3 of us, except for Matt, well, the 3 residents all went to 3 different seminaries, so probably had profoundly different experiences, but I hijacked Alexander's time.
And I'll admit, like Matt, like he has a different degree than I do. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with his program not requiring practical theology because it's a graduate program versus a professional degree.
Right. I have no practical education whatsoever. Yeah. And I'm not being facetious. That's true. I don't.
Yeah. I mean, seminary was not easy or fun for me for the most part, other than maybe socially. I made great lifelong friends in seminary, but it was hard almost every day in a lot of ways. So I could talk about this for a long time, but if I were queen for a day, everyone would be taking worship classes every semester, right? Our seminaries are not forming worship leaders. I really don't believe that. Show me a seminary that is, and that'll be exciting to me. But like, and I did a lot of research as part of I worked in the Office of Worship Life, and I did a lot of research into other PCUSA seminaries other seminaries of our size, what they were doing in their chapel life and things like that. And I think the practical side of things is woefully inadequate, and that's really sad. And yeah, it's sort of like, do I trust students who are trying to form themselves as pastors to choose classes that will form them well? Not really, honestly. I don't trust myself to do that. I wasn't taking elective courses in pastoral care. I took one pastoral care class. Should I have taken more? Probably, but I loved other things. You know what I mean? So it's, I would say that all of my liturgical formation, not all of it, a lot of my liturgical formation occurred entirely outside of the seminary process in college, or things I was doing outside of seminary. I think CPE was really helpful, where we had to be chaplains for a 10-week period. That was pretty helpful for me in learning how to be with people. But yeah, I just got too fiery about that. But
I have a follow-up, and then we'll end here. But that I think is at the intersection of what all three of you were saying, and I think it recognizes how difficult this is. It's like, so I think, one, we need a better definition for what it means to be practical. And I think Alexandra, doubling down on the idea that like what a pastor does is lead worship is a really helpful sort of gesture at that. Because I think what I heard is like, so Nate's basic thing was like, he's not sure whether it's the church, I won't say failing, but like there's a big gap between what is important, it seems like, to the church and what is important, it seems like, to the seminary institution. And so I don't want to take your words out of context, but it's just a totally different kind of thing. And
no, I mean, just like to put some skin on it, right? Like if you spend a large portion of your week worrying about bulletin changes, like I would just argue that worrying about theology is more important and true to what we ought to be doing.
Right. And so it's like, but to Keith's statement too, it's like there's this translation piece. And so it's like, what's really difficult about this is it's really incredibly difficult, I think, to try to teach people to care about the right things, and unless they, and if they don't already kind of care about theology or worship or what have you, it's really hard to like understand the role of the pastor, the spiritual leader, as someone that is actually not trying to like make things run smoothly. Not that we don't want things to run smoothly, but it's actually like, teaching and revealing something. And so I think when people hear practical theology, they think like counseling or something. And I don't think that's a good way to understand it, right? I think it's better to say like, okay, how are the theological truths or the scriptural truths or the traditional truths, how are they to be talked about to congregants now? And I think that is the really, really hard bit, just because I actually see the seminary kind of moving in this direction as the church is moving in this direction. So I don't know, like, I would just wonder how you'd respond to that, like this, or talk a little bit more about what it means to be practical and how we have to always guard against practical not meaning like to just give the people what they want.
Yeah, and it's good that you made the distinction, because I talk about practical theology a lot. That's like kind of my MO, is like practical theology and walking around with the Book of Order.
That's true, by the way. That's true.
A lot of people think that like, practical theology is like a completely separate sort of like discipline, where it looks like counseling or a pastoral care class or a Christian education class. But when I say practical theology, it means like, how do we apply the stuff that would be considered not practical theology in our real life and in our ministry? Because hopefully, like, if we're doing this pastor thing right, and if we're doing the Christian thing right, we're thinking about all this stuff all the time in everything that we do. But we've not been trained to think in that way of like, even like something that seems like as mundane as folding bulletins or making stuff look nice. Like what are theological thing is going on here? Because everything that we do as pastors, like even the mundane stuff is still like necessary parts of ministry. Like I know that back home, like my home pastor is a part-time plumber for the church because it's a historic building, and maintaining the grounds, maintaining the pipes of the bathrooms, like that's still doing ministry. But we don't think about it in theological terms of like being stewards or that type of language. It's just like, well, the bathroom fixed and I gotta go play plumber. And so like, making a translational piece, and that's kind of an extreme thing. Like we can think about everything theologically.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm getting at. It's like I'm trying to interrogate or like at least question how the question comes up. Like, what does the Trinity, what does the doctrine of the Trinity, what does the Trinity have to do with my daily life? And it's like everything. It has everything to do with it. It's always important. And it's really hard to like, I think, translate why theology matters. I know that seems silly, but it's like, no. What we believe, it sort of, all of our actions kind of stem hopefully out of what we believe and what we confess and how we worship. And so thank you, Keith, for that. Like, I think that's really helpful.
I mean, now I'm thinking a little bit out loud, but I would almost say the opposite, right? There's a concept in Eastern Orthodox liturgical theology and probably other liturgical theologies too, where there's an understanding that the liturgy, and that means what we do on Sunday morning, essentially, broadly conceived, is primary theology. Like what we do is primary theology. Everything that we say about it, sitting in classes talking about what we're doing, is secondary. And I think that we think about that, at least in the main line, flipped upside down. Whereas I would hope in the future that we would grow into an understanding that what we do in the liturgy is who we are. And everything that we talk about is sort of over that, secondary. It's all, it's not primarily who we are. Does that make sense?
Yes, I love that, Alexandra, that idea of practice informs belief rather than we come to right belief and then we do the practices. I think that's very true. That resonates as very true with me. Though they're always in tandem and always a dance between the two.
Or like right praxis is belief in a certain, right. It's sort of that. Yeah.
This could get very complicated.
Yeah, sorry.
But it is sort of the idea that like in the same way, we're reformed, right? So just recognizing that like belief is a kind of thing that you do. And that's why we think it's silly to think that like our beliefs are what save us, and that's why we sort of, we interpret that back into the scripture, right? It's like, if what it means to be saved is to believe in Jesus, well, then that's just another iteration of works theology or works grace. And so that's kind of how I think about it, right? Where like materially what you do actually conveys who you are. And the other stuff is either true or not. You can say you believe whatever, but it's either true or not true based on how you live your life, how you experience your, I've been saying this into the devotionals, is like how your faith walks around. So yeah. Okay. Well,
that felt like a plug for our crossing the lynching tree.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get it. Yeah. We'll talk about that. Yeah. That got a little out of hand. So, all right. Well, hey, if y'all, so something that I'd say to the First Presbyterian Church community, now that all four of us are on your screens, that I've said to individuals on the residency committee before, but I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it hopeful and educational, encouraging. But I also want to express gratitude to the First Pres community that well, couple things, right? That my position was created, and I got to experience First Pres in this community with 3 residents, right? It's so awesome to come when we were able to come to church, to like do ministry in exist in the world in ministry with 3 other young, incredibly intelligent, and incredibly generous and faithful people. So I want to thank the First Pres community for making this possible, right? Creating the conditions that the 4 of us could be walking the halls together at the church, and engaged in this community. So we're going to do this again, hopefully, unless, you guys we get a lot of feedback that you guys really didn't like it. And then we probably will anyway, because that undercuts everything that we just said about making the church a market. We really appreciate you. If you tuned in, please email any of us or comment wherever this is going to appear. We'd love to answer some of the questions that you have. If maybe we will, but we just want to wish everybody courage and hope that you're staying safe. And I hope that you feel loved, because the community of First Pres is praying for you and loves you, and wants the best for you during this time. And so thank you, Keith and Alexandra and Nate, for doing this. And we can't wait to do this again.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Matt.
Matt.